Thanks so much for joining us. Today, it's going to be me in conversation with Dr. Sara Löfqvist, and we're going to be doing a big Q&A as well. Dr. Sara Löfqvist did her PhD a few years ago, looking into how to scale biodiversity finance equitably, and wrote a series of really important and influential publications, including a really comprehensive interview with investors and asset managers to understand the challenges and opportunities for upscaling private finance into nature conservation. Since then, I did a European study that focused on a similar theme, also interviewing financiers and investors. And so between us, we've interviewed over 50 people asking about the challenges and opportunities for upscaling private investment. We got a decent overview of how that looks in Europe and how that looks for European American investors outside Europe and America as well. Sara, thanks so much for being here. And we'll start with, I think, a really useful framing question. What is biodiversity finance?
Right. Thanks for having me, Sophus. In short, biodiversity finance, I think how most people conceptualize it, is finance going into a landscape with the aim for biodiversity uplift or protection. A more complex answer is that we don't know, because people define nature finance in very different ways. Some would simply look at any finance going in with a direct aim for biodiversity uplift. Some look at enabling finance, some look at transition finance. And this is a problem, right? People classify it in different ways, and that makes it difficult to understand general patterns of biodiversity finance. And a big thing you and I have discussed recently is like if offset finance should be included, because on the one hand, it does go into landscape and it does do, in best case scenario, good things there, right? But at the same time, in a best case scenario, the overarching effect is net zero because it is offsetting damage elsewhere.
One of the things that I've found talking with practitioners about biodiversity finance is that in my head, it's categorized into sort of three broad categories, and all of them refer to slightly different things, maybe four. But one of them, we have, I think, what the conservationists and ecologists in the room might recognize as biodiversity finance. So this is financing conservation, so financing ecosystems. And that's actually the kind of thing that Sara and I have specialized in. There's this one whole branch of conservation finance, which is all about how we attract and raise investment for investment in conservation measures. And that can be public or private. But then for mainstream financiers, if you look at what they categorize as biodiversity finance or biodiversity focused funds, a lot of that is basically investable land management, where the implication on biodiversity is sort of a co-benefit or assumed, but not explicitly designed as part of the investment as well. A lot of these biodiversity-focused private investment funds will do things like focus on certified forestry or sustainable agriculture, or even ag tech, so like sustainable intensification as well, stuff for reducing the pressures on biodiversity. And then we've got the whole macro finance crew who also study biodiversity finance, but their emphasis, I think, is on the macro scale risks to the economy and the financial system from nature loss. There's this whole team of macroeconomists, both mainstream and heterodox macro, doing financial stress testing, etc. And that is looking at the degree to which the financial system is at risk from biodiversity loss. That was my conceptualization. But you touched on another one that I think was really interesting, transition finance. So can you go into a little bit more detail about what you mean by that?
So that would basically be any finance that allows an industry to transition into operations that better align with biodiversity values. And this is, again, very difficult to define, right? Different industries and different corporations are going to define that in different ways. At the same time, finance, in the end, have an even bigger impact on nature, right? So it's something that's very important for us to include, but it's less straightforward than, what you're talking about is like direct investments in nature. So discussions we're having now, right? How do we classify finance, nature finance, in a way that encompasses all of this, but at the same time shows that different types of nature finance do different things?
Let's quickly go into financing ecosystem restoration. What are the different kinds of mechanisms that we have available for funding restoration across both public and private finance?
Public finance still accounts for like the vast majority of finance going into nature. Again, noting that we can't properly track this, but it's around 80% from the recent estimates you either have direct public finance, right, which is, say, a domestic government investing in protecting domestic landscapes. You also have the multilateral and bilateral funds, and that's, for example, Norway channeling funding to troubled countries to promote conservation or ecosystem restoration there. Also, increasingly nature-based credits, and we do see some movement in this under like Article 6 in the Paris Agreement, which now might be easier for countries to buy nature-based carbon credits to meet their NDCs. So we still don't know to what extent this will take off, but this is, as of now, a potential way for public finance as well, even though I guess most people think of carbon and biodiversity finance as more like a private funding mechanism. For private finance, that's also one of the big things, right? A lot of corporations have signed up for net zero agreements as part of the science-based targets and so on, and are often aiming to reach those targets by these type of credits. So that's a big thing. A lot of the private funding is also insetting, which is basically offsetting, but within your supply chain. So that could be an agricultural company that invests in resilience of their own supply chain. Their commodities are dependent upon. We also see quite a big chunk of private finance as donations. So that will come from marketing budgets as part of CSR efforts. And then, of course, there are certain nature projects that have an inherent business case, and for that reason could attract more mainstream investments. And that's not the biggest chunk, and I guess we'll come to that later. And it's a sort of narrow set of nature investments, as Sophus said, like agroforestry and plantations and so on. But that is also then one of the mechanisms of private finance.
There's an enormous issue with double counting between different types of finance as well. So I think we'll get onto later in the conversation, actually tracking accounting. But let's just go through a couple of these hypothetical case studies that show how complicated it is to actually track who's paying for what in conservation investment. So if we think, for example, of blended finance funds, where you have a big chunk of concessional capital from the public sector and a bunch of private investment securing market rate returns that are de-risked by the public sector, then it's really hard to attribute what counts as public, what counts as private finance. You also have a lot of biodiversity businesses who generate biodiversity improvements as their core business activity, who get all of their revenues from public finance or public regulations as well. So to conceptualize why in academia we find it really hard to pin down what biodiversity finance is because as soon as you scratch underneath the surface of many of these so-called private finance mechanisms, they're often underpinned by either public regulations or by public finance in some form. It's interesting. Several years ago, you wrote this very influential Nature, Ecology and Evolution paper where you outlined the case for an emphasis on private finance into nature conservation. Now, do you mind reviewing that argument for our listeners?
The main way I see it there is that private finance is already going into landscapes, right? And it's currently doing a lot of damage. So rather than framing it as we need to mobilize finance for nature, we rather need to shift financial flows that are currently degrading nature into those that better promote the nature outcomes we aspire towards. Also, I guess there's a big narrative, right, that we don't have enough public funding. And that's true under current capitalist playing rules. But, and this is again something you and I have talked about, we don't have private and public funding in two separate buckets, and we need to work for them separately. One option is that we design financial mechanisms and we encourage private finance to go into nature. That has proven to be very difficult. Another option we always have is that we instead tax private actors, and we basically turn private funding into public funding in that way. And this is again like a question about political acceptability, and obviously we then need to vote for leaders and make nature a fiscal priority. But right to your point, what you just said, it's not that straightforward. But private finance, the way it is now, is currently acting in nature, doing a lot of damage. Those flows need to be shifted, but we also need more finance for nature conservation.
So what is the biodiversity funding gap?
700 billion is what we've been told, right? So even though there's like rigorous calculations behind all this, right? And I think it is important we try to understand it. At the same time, it's difficult to know what actually is encompassed by that. And what we have seen, even if we do mobilize 700 billion, now I don't have the numbers in my head, but there's like trillions going into nature destructive. why private finance hasn't upscaled, and now I'm like drawing on your work, right? But the operating environment for private finance does not allow it to. So we still have a policy framework that largely allows, to some extent even encourages private finance to go into investments that are destructive for nature. So I think that is really what we primarily need to tackle. If we have an operating environment for private finance that better allows it to go into nature in a way that's equitable, that will help a lot. Going then to the role of public finance, as flawed as governments may be, right? They're still accountable to the public in a way private finance is not. And what we've seen in both your work and my work is that private finance that goes into nature, say on its own accord, biases towards certain project types, monoculture plantation being one of them, agroforestry another. And this is, can be great in certain areas, but it's also often not the type of nature outcomes that are most equitable, and maybe also not the best for actual biodiversity. So we also, in one of my prior studies, we also saw that private finance shies away from many of the areas that have the highest biodiversity value because they are deemed politically risky, it's potential corruption, and investors then might decide to go into an area that is more politically safe, but where the need for conservation or restoration might not be as large. When we somehow know the patterns of biodiversity finance going towards certain project types and certain regions, public finance can step in and fill the gap where private finance is not going. It's also certain projects like natural regeneration, for example, which we know does not have an inherent business case and often struggle to attract private finance.
So people who are tuning in here, the key is that what is required to make a land management project investable, it requires certain characteristics which are very, very rarely provided by conservation and the revenue mechanisms that you can generate through conservation. And there's the fundamental problem here. The fundamental problem is that biodiversity and land management outcomes are often sold into markets where there is a great deal of uncertainty around prices. And so investors are not able to pin down specific cash flows into the long term that help them make their business case in a solid way. There's issues about nature recovery being rather slow. So discounted cash flows systematically undervalue future gains. And this means that a lot of nature conservation projects, the calculus for investing in conservation just doesn't stack up because lots of the gains occur in the future. And there's all sorts of interesting issues with transaction size as well. So nature conservation typically has rather small individual projects, transaction sizes, whereas institutional investment is normally flowing into ticket sizes over $25 million, for example. So then there's all this work in nature conservation to try and ask, can we aggregate different types of conservation projects together to aggregate a bunch of smaller projects into a kind of a large portfolio? That's the kind of thing that might attract private finance. But again, it's not been enormously successful on its own terms at attracting private finance into nature conservation so far. And the kinds of revenue streams that these kinds of projects might develop are, as we've talked about, a bunch of revenue streams that are fundamentally underpinned by public finance, like attracting agricultural subsidies, grazing subsidies, etc. Revenue streams that might come from public regulation. So that's largely sale into compliance markets. These are especially big in the United States, for example. And then, the other really high profile revenue stream from the commodification of nature that people have been talking about, and which is very interesting because it is voluntary. So it has not been created through government regulation, is the international voluntary carbon market. And that's something, again, that Sara and I have looked into, and we'll get into more detail with Sara later. So that's the kind of overall picture, right? That some of the challenges at upscaling private investment in nature. Over the last couple of years, we've interviewed a lot of financiers, investors, asset managers, and biodiversity finance experts to ask about what are the challenges and opportunities and how can these things be overcome. So you did this study a few years ago where you interviewed institutional asset managers and financiers. And I did one led one this year with colleagues that was focused more on biodiversity finance in Europe. Where we don't have things like the international voluntary carbon market to the same degree, but there are other kinds of policy drivers, etc. Across all of our work and some of the other work, for example, by Megan Evans, which has done similar kinds of interviews in Australia, what do you think are some of the really important themes that you see as key takeaways that people should learn from?
to start with something positive, right? And I think that's something we all see, that there are circumstances where private finance can do a lot of good in nature, to set that as a baseline. And there are a lot of projects that are trying and are delivering good biodiversity outcomes. But at the same time, and I think that's something all of us have found, right? There is an inherent mismatch between private profit objectives and what is required for a landscape to be sustainable over time. And there's also an inherent mismatch between private profit objectives, often by global north actors, and what a local community desires for their landscape. And again, noting that they are the ones who are most affected and most vulnerable to landscape change. I think what I really loved about your paper is how it sort of set this groundwork for what type of regulations and policies we actually need to safeguard all of this. And basically, again, saying that I feel like there's a strong narrative that, yeah, we need to encourage private finance to go in a certain way. We need to design financial mechanisms to help finance deliver these outcomes. But I think what all of us have found is just not always possible. So this win-win narrative, I mean, we should strive towards it, but I think it's also important to acknowledge that it's not always something we can do. And that's where basically what we need to do is we need to change the operating environment of private finance. And we need stronger regulations to hold them accountable for environmental harm, but also to make it easier for them to go into landscapes in a way that delivers long-term outcomes. And again, something your paper pointed towards then is that it's very difficult to fund long-term monitoring. Because of that, we see private finance often going into nature, in restoration, often just planting trees, right? Because that's the one thing they have funding for. But then what actually happens with those trees 5 years later, we don't know, because we don't have the funding for the monitoring. And even less so, we don't have the funding to monitor how different identity groups in the landscape have been affected by this intervention. I guess, in short, the role for public finance and public regulations to step in and steer these flows, I think, is the main conclusion we've all come to.
A couple of other things come to mind as well. So one is, I think, this really interesting finding in your work that because of the specific aspects of nature that we have created commodification mechanisms for, which is basically food and carbon and biomass, everything else has remained rather uncommodified. It just means that finance goes into quite specific ecologies. So one of the things I took away from your work is how some of the most environmentally beneficial ecological processes, like natural regeneration, just don't fit comfortably in with existing prevailing commodification mechanisms. Private finance is attracted into the specific types of ecology that generate revenues. But as ecologists or conservationists, we should be aware that often these are actually not the ecologies that conservationists or ecologists would recognize as the most valuable ones. They're just the most commodifiable. And then the other one, this interplay between public and private, I think is just really critical. You know, that's the conclusion that we both came to after interviewing 50 or so people on this. I came away from our interviews feeling conservationists often underestimate the incredible challenge, what it actually would mean to create scalable private investment in nature. In short, because private finance chases commercial risk-return ratios, if you want private finance to go into nature conservation, it won't do it on its own. It requires that you, the conservationist, and the government, who are combined, create the set of incentives and institutions that the operating environment within private finance seeks returns. If you want private finance to go into nature conservation projects, you need to actually fundamentally reshape the whole world in order to create investable projects, create commercial risk-return ratios from conservation projects. And I did leave thinking this is an unbelievably daunting challenge. So we have, the occasional private investment project in conservation that does achieve commercial returns, but they are really isolated, piecemeal, individual case studies. And if you want that thing to happen at scale, governments need to bring in really solid regulations that create stable cash flows, bring in standards that are sufficiently high that the price of credits is high enough to attract private investment, to create an investable business case and attract private investment. I came away thinking that private finance is actually so much more risk averse than I ever thought, given the public narratives on how entrepreneurial private finance is. But unless conservationists and governments totally transform the incentives around nature conservation projects, then I just can't see private finance upscaling at scale. So you'll get the individual isolated case studies, but you won't get the scale that everybody seems to demand. And that ultimately, after all of these interviews, I came away thinking this really would be so much easier if we could just upscale public finance. So the politics of it came back into the picture. There's this implicit assumption that because we're fiscally constrained, it's more unreasonable to upscale public finance than private finance right now. And after interviewing all these people and reading your work, I came away thinking, actually, no, it's still more reasonable to upscale public finance through conventional mechanisms than it is to reshape the world in service of private finance. I think that those were some of the big takeaways that I took away from our interviews. What do you think about that?
I mean, this comes back to this like narrative of turning nature bankable. And as you say, it's super difficult, but beyond that, it's also dangerous. What we then would need to do is we would need to skew landscape projects so they would always yield a return. And as you say, we can do that through credits, right? And then maybe safeguard some of the objectives. But what we're then doing is we're letting private finance objectives set the agenda for the environmental discourse. And that is just insanely dangerous. So I would say the same, right? It's too difficult and it's too dangerous. And we have the option of instead drawing that money in through taxes and supporting nature recovery in a way that better aligns with what's good for long-term nature outcomes, but also for people.
So one thing that becomes very clear from reviewing the evidence in the real world, like we've done, is that the real world is just extremely messy, right? There are very few really precise, clean answers here. So what are, we've alluded to some of them, some of the fundamental trade-offs that are required in attracting private finance for investment in nature? And then I want to go into some of your PhD work with some of your personal experience from some of these projects, right, where you've seen some of the trade-offs experienced in on-the-ground projects.
There's so many different actor groups that have a stake in how a landscape is altered, and these actor groups are going to have different objectives. So a private financier from the global north will care about, or any financier, right, will care about the nature outcomes, and that makes a lot of sense as nature finance. But you have a local community living there who cares about what their livelihoods that is dependent on the landscape. And that livelihood, if we leave that ongoing, may not optimize for the nature outcomes. And I would argue that that's okay. A lot of the objectives from the global north is about carbon. And if we go into landscape and we optimize it for carbon drawdown, we would just plant a bunch of trees and we would leave them standing. And that's often not what allows a community to thrive. So we have all of these different objectives. We have the trade-offs between them. And at the same time, we have very strong power imbalances. And I think that's the biggest problem, that often the actor that channel finance into landscape, they have the funding, they have the power to skew the landscape in a way that suits their objective, whilst the local community living on the ground is most vulnerable and most affected to landscape change. And I guess one case that is pretty famous is, and again, knowing that REDD+ has done a lot of good, but in Peru, there was cases where because they didn't have secure tenure, they basically, local communities were removed from land they were dependent upon in order for that land to be used for carbon offsets. And I guess my own work that I did in Mexico, we assessed social justice outcomes from a mangrove restoration project funded partly by credits. And all in all, this is a very successful project. It's big success cases of mangrove restoration credits, and it's succeeded with its environmental objectives. It's also left the community better off. But what we did see going in there and interviewing a lot of people across the board was a big difference in how this project had affected people. Whilst on the surface, we had local community benefits, the costs and the benefits of those, it had fallen differently on different identity groups. And I think this comes down again to understanding intra-community trade-offs that you often have in a community, local elites, often male, who own land. And they are inherently going to benefit when you channel carbon finance into that project. But you also have other people in the community living on that land who will reap less benefits. That can create a lot of tension within the community when all of a sudden a small subgroup of local elites earn a lot of money and the larger majority are just not reaping the same extent of benefits. So I think one of my main takeaways that we need to understand that communities are not homogenous, that there's like very strong power imbalances at play within communities, and different people within those groups are going to be affected very differently. So if we do social monitoring, for example, or pre-screening by just going in and having a community consultation where we talk to the village chiefs or the local leaders, we're likely not going to capture the full risk profile of finance going into the landscape.
What you've described, the patterns of the unequal distribution of the costs and the benefits of the outcomes of the carbon project, basically. I think a lot of people would level the same kind of insight at just ordinary economic development. You have winners, you have losers, etc. Was there anything in your case study context that you think that was specifically about carbon-focused development that was different from ordinary industrial development?
I think one thing I found interesting was that, and this I did not expect to find, restoration often comes with strong gender inequalities, and to some extent because of the nature of the work. And what the carbon financier were requiring was a certain amount of female employments. And because that was required, that was now something that was pushed for more. So that was, I guess, in a way, carbon finance driving equity by setting conditions to the finance linked to equity. And I had not seen that before. And I think you need to be careful with that, right? And not going in and imposing your view of the world, and understanding that communities operate in different ways in different parts of the world. But it shows that if finance does account for equity, and if it does think about all these things carefully before, it can also skew projects to be more equitable. And again, it's messy and it's difficult, but that was like probably one of the things I personally found most interesting from that work.
Thanks so much for that. So let's return to the definition stuff around nature finance. Let's go big picture again after zooming in. So although there are these published estimates of how much nature finance flows into ecosystems, it's naturally just really difficult to determine how much is genuinely contributing to biodiversity outcomes because of like challenges in biodiversity accounting for transaction costs, etc. So what are some of these challenges, and what are their implications for biodiversity conservation?
As we said, like classification, right? We don't fully know which type of finance we are talking about, and people are talking about different things. Another big thing is transparency. Even though we don't really know which numbers we are looking for, it's also difficult to access them. What you alluded to before, right? We risk getting an inflated sense of scale of finance going into nature. I mean, we also risk getting an inflated sense of progress towards environmental goals. And that's very harmful for the entire environmental movement, because we equate scale of funding to progress towards environmental goals. And that's also something that comes from the lack of transparency and lack of challenges with classification, is that just because we channel a bunch of finance into nature, that does not necessarily mean that finance is doing good. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's realizing the objectives we need to do. And that's also discussions you and I have been having, right? About like how we rather need to focus on tracking outcomes of finance rather than scale of finance. And also that nature finance alone says nothing if we don't discuss it in relation to harmful finance going into nature.
Follows on very, very nicely the next bit. We talked a little bit about the framing around the global biodiversity funding gap, the fundamental framing that underpins almost this whole research area around upscaling private investment into nature conservation. And the framing is that we only spend a certain amount on nature conservation. We need to spend a lot more to achieve overall nature conservation objectives. Public finance is fundamentally constrained in today's macroeconomic environment, and therefore the only option that we have is to create commodification mechanisms that attract mainstream private investment, right? So that is the framing. What are the problems with this framing? What are the potential implications?
Yeah, and I think this to some extent sums up what we were talking about, that the main problem is not lack of funding. And with that, again, not saying that funding mobilization is not important, because we do need to do that. But there's such a strong focus on that in the current biodiversity funding discourse that risks detracting attention away from what's actually the biggest problem, right? Which is harmful finance going into nature. So even if we upscale finance, unless we address the massive financial counterpressure on nature, that finance won't matter. It will never reach the results we hope for it to do. And at the same time, we have an entire macroeconomic system that's very unjust and that largely undermines biodiversity goals. So one of these big things is that we have a strong sovereign debt injustice. We have many countries in the global south that are very close to debt distress. If we think of the solution as filling a funding gap, and a lot of this funding is channeled to these countries in the form of loans, it just risks creating this like reinforcing loop between risk of sovereign debt distress and inability to use loans to realize that, right? And we also know that countries that are at risk of debt distress are more inclined to like degrade nature in order to service that debt and gain foreign currency to do that. And this is again like work by Roman Swartzman and Jeff Althaus. But so basically we have an entire macroeconomic system that is working against the goals we aspire to do. And then this outsized focus on filling the funding gap can be dangerous because it detracts attention away from the bigger problems we need to resolve. I don't know if you agree with that.
I definitely do. And I want to go into some more detail about some of your most recent work then, where you've been tracking how some of these dynamics have actually played out in major international biodiversity policies. So can you go into a bit more detail on that?
In the coming Montreal Agreement, we see a lot of movement towards trying to address harmful subsidies, for example. Issue being that we don't have a very clear pathway to do so. So I think it's great that these things are being discussed, and we just need to keep working on providing pathways on how to better do it. And yeah, I guess that's one thing we see. And in a paper you and I and a bunch of colleagues have in review, we looked at climate finance, not nature finance, right? And we see that the former UNFCCC climate targets was reached in, I think, 2022. Again, massively outsized by fossil fuel subsidies. And even though we reached the target, carbon accumulation in the atmosphere continued to increase. And I think that says something about that maybe we're not setting the right targets.
As we wrap this up and move to the Q&A, what are the most promising areas for future research in biodiversity finance research, knowing what you now know, right? From the last decade of staring at this in a lot of detail and pulling out the real questions underneath the high level societal stereotypes, basically, right? The stereotypes like we just need more private finance. What are the kind of the real systemic new frontiers in biodiversity finance that you think people should be focusing on?
A main thing is this, I mean, we just talked about subsidies. How do we make this subsidy shift in a way that is politically feasible? And how do we do it in a way that's also equitable? Because we've seen that when we do these subsidy shifts, it could often be that the people who are benefiting from the subsidies are more vulnerable groups. And how can we ensure that we shift subsidies towards those that better align with nature values in a way that's long-term, politically feasible, and also does not exacerbate current social injustices? So I think we just need more research and more understanding on exactly how that could be done. Another big aspect is about this bigger injustices in the international monetary system that we need to address, or otherwise there's no way we're going to reach our biodiversity targets. A big aspect there is currency hierarchies and how different currencies affect to what extent nature finance can be leveraged. But it is also about sovereign debt justice. And we've seen some movement on this with debt for nature swaps and so on, but an issue there is partly there's big transaction costs, but it also risks reinforcing new forms of dependencies because the actor behind the loan or the debt for nature swap largely can set the agenda, right? So how can we design debt relief mechanisms in a way that enables policy autonomy in global south countries with the aim for like long-term equitable biodiversity outcomes?
My shout out to all the economists and econometricians out there. I think as I look into nature credits more, as I work with people like Sara to look into the specific ways that we commodify nature, create markets around them, and create business cases and revenue streams around nature, I basically think increasingly all of the dichotomies, public versus private, carbon versus biodiversity. Basically, I'm increasingly thinking that all of these dichotomies are breaking down, and we need to be doing more impact evaluations, econometric studies on the actual outcomes of different mechanism designs across public and private finance to work out which ones are truly the most effective. I would just love it if somebody spent more time looking at the specific transaction costs involved with the different types of finance as well, because there are just really clearly costs and benefits to different ways of funding ecosystems. Public finance has the cleanliness of not needing to commodify nature in the same way, but we also know that there are often large transaction costs involved in public policies and subsidy schemes. We also know that public subsidy schemes are often quite poorly targeted, and so improvements in mechanism design, I think, can really help improve the ecological efficiency of public biodiversity finance. I really would make a big call for that. And similarly, the high level policy narrative that we need to do this through upscaling private investment also doesn't properly acknowledge some of the costs of upscaling private investment. And for example, I really want to know more about the transaction costs involved in creating and scaling nature markets. So that's all the stuff that government needs to do to actually create the things. And that's, I'm interested in the intermediaries, the transaction costs and potential rent seeking involved in intermediaries in those markets, and then working out how much money actually reached the ground through nature markets. I think all of these are interesting frontiers that I'm hoping people will work on over the next 5 or 10 years. So thanks so much for this, Sara. It's been really great. We're going to move on to questions now. And we've got the first question online from Gail. So the question is, thanks both for your interesting insights. A lot of the issues with private finance seem to do with the returns requirements. Given this, do you think it's possible to scale private finance that doesn't have the returns requirements, e.g., corporate foundations, CSR, direct donations to nature-related projects, basically concessional capital or non-return seeking capital? Will these sources always face a scale issue, or are there ways to increase them, e.g., increased public pressure? So it's a great question.
I think there are ways to increase private finance. I think we're always going to see that finance going in certain directions. And it's going to be much more difficult to do so in a way that covers all types of landscape interventions we need to do. From where I'm standing, and I guess based on my knowledge as of today, I don't think so. I don't think we can ever upscale private finance to the extent it will fund long-term nature recovery and protection in a way that's equitable, because private finance always has an inherent profit objective, right? And then, as you said, right, we can channel it for donations or CSR purposes, but that also comes with requirements. So one of the things that I found in one of my recent studies was even that type of finance requires like storytelling potential, but communicating in a short marketing campaign the benefits from natural regeneration is just not possible. So I think any type of private finance is always going to be steered in a certain way. Yeah, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Sophus.
It comes back to what you were saying earlier, I think, as well. The dichotomies between public and private, for me, have sort of broken down. So the easiest way to attract private investment in nature is to tax income, wealth, capital gains, etc., and to utilize that as funds for spending on public goods. Right? So the larger the pool of private finance, the larger potential dividends from taxation. Right? So the question is, there is no real answer, but all there is different political economies of different arrangements of getting to the place that we need to be. And somewhere, a decision maker, somebody who wants to fund biodiversity, has to pick a political economic fight. And it comes from somewhere. It either comes through increasing taxation, or in the case of markets, there's always a political economic fight. And you can upscale private investment, you can upscale public investment, and all of them are just a choice of which political economic fight you're going to pick. That's my feeling. Okay, next question. To what extent should impact investors exercise restraint in pursuing nature-positive loans and investment? And under what circumstances might such restraint be warranted? So that's very interesting. Okay, so that's about impact investors and philanthropy, people who are potentially accepting concessional returns. Should they pursue this as an investment class at all?
That was, I think, also one of my biggest personal takeaways from one of my recent studies on this, that I thought impact investors would be much more risk prone. And every single impact investor I talked to said, okay, but we still need to do due diligence. We still need to provide a risk return profile to the people who invest with us, right? And even an impact investor, they have so many asset classes they can go into. So they can go into renewable energy, sustainable transport, and restoration or conservation is still largely a new asset class. So I guess my first point is that I think we need to be careful with putting too much trust in impact investors, because they are still largely acting on the similar playing rules as more conventional investors. They have this philanthropic objective, which is great, but they still can't go into an asset class that they don't understand, that don't deliver return. But with that said, I don't see an issue with impact investors pursuing it. I know there's a lot of impact investors really trying to build track records, are trying to understand how and when investments can do good. So that I think is great.
That's a wonderful answer. So next question. In your work, have you got a sense of how much the rate of return expectation might need to shift for private investors to give nature a more animated look? If high return opportunities fall away, for example, in a post-fossil fuel investment landscape, would that change your conclusion? So if like the actual commercial rates of risk-adjusted returns shift downwards because there's less investable opportunities, do we think this is going to become more feasible? And that links on the context of damaging subsidies and changes in macroeconomic structure. So that's the question. There's an additional comment, which is on sort of the last point, tax appetites vary across cities, regions, and countries for a range of reasons, and that's distinct from bureaucratic ease. So do we worry that public finance itself might be unreliable in terms of our big international goals? So that's a wonderful question on the scalability of public versus private finance. Okay, so let's go for the first question for you, Sara. So if the return expectations shifted down across the market as a whole, would that make these kinds of nature-focused opportunities more prevalent?
It would, right? I just don't think it's realistic. It's going to do that to the scale needed where these finance flows will shift enough. I think that's also one of the big differences with nature restoration or conservation contra other sustainable asset classes. I mean, compared to renewable energy, for example, you can put up windmill and that can yield a return, but in a landscape there's always an opportunity cost. So for nature to be in itself have a higher risk return ratio than agriculture, I just don't think that will ever at scale be like it won't ever shift to the extent that we'll see this big shift in private finance. But again, like we see it in some circumstances, right, as with agroforestry and so on, but there's still a very strong counter pressure. So I think yes, but at scale, I don't think it's going to happen.
Yeah, my hunch is the only real data that we know about this, I think, is from the Flammer et al. Biodiversity finance paper from 2025, where they actually look at the investment profile of a portfolio of nature-focused investments from an anonymous, large-scale sustainable asset manager. And they ask, what actual stuff is this asset manager investing in? And what they find is that for private finance pure plays, so that's with no de-risking, they were investing in projects that had a internal rate of return around 15% a year. And even with some blending, so even with some element of public finance or de-risking, they were still looking for investments that had just under 12% a year IRR. Now, my hunch is that there is a tiny slice of conservation that can deliver you those kinds of returns. There is a tiny slice of conservation that sits just below those returns that can't yet attract commercial investment. And with a change of overarching expectations, maybe that small additional slice might then enter the commercial viability. But that the vast majority of conservation sits nowhere near those internal rates of return. That would be my hunch. And therefore, the vast majority of it would not come into play without some other major systemic changes more than just weak economic performance as a whole, I think. So that's my hunch. Okay, and the last question was this one on the relative scalability on public and private finance. Yes, of course, the public tax appetites vary enormously across countries, no doubt about it. And I don't have the answers on that one at all, other than to say that, as I said, I came into this whole area thinking that the myth that private finance is more scalable than public finance was true. And I now don't think that's the case, but I don't have the answers in every individual context. So that's where my suspicion comes from. I don't have a hunch that private finance is inherently more scalable than public finance based on the recent experience in the markets that I know well. Okay, our time is up. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining us. Sara, I don't know if you have anything to say, but that's it from me. And thanks, everybody, for joining.
Yeah, no, amazing. Thank you so much, Sophus.